you know. As for women, in 1933, 2 million women are out of work. And they get a strong ally in Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife. She was an advocate for child welfare and equal rights for women and minorities. She worked to have women included in New Deal programs, and it did see some success. It definitely did not employ the number of women as it did men, and women didn't always get the work. They would maybe get more like skills training and things like that. But it did see some success. Also, interestingly, Frances Perkins, who was a labor rights activist from New York, becomes the first woman to hold a cabinet level position when she's appointed Secretary of Labor by FDR. And she really becomes known as the architect of the New Deal. A lot of the programs that come out of the New Deal are her brainchildren. FDR crafted the New Deal policies, and he wanted them to apply to all Americans. African Americans appreciated this effort and supported him, which formed a major voting bloc for him. A voting bloc is a large group of citizens who share a common concern and tend to vote in the same elections. In 1933, African American employment rates are at 50%. Remember, the national average is 26. So the Public Works Administration provided equal employment opportunities, but often this wasn't followed at a local level. But those that were able to find a job and be hired helped build schools and hospitals in the segregated South. The Works Progress Administration also provided jobs for African Americans. African Americans really admired Eleanor Roosevelt and her efforts to support minorities and women. However, there was no attempt made by FDR or his administration to dismantle segregation or voter suppression. The anti-lynching bill, which had been trying to be passed through Congress since the turn of the century, was defeated in Congress, and many felt FDR should have shown support, but he worried that he would alienate Southern Democrats who he needed to ensure that he could get his programs through Congress. Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans faced their own set of challenges during this time. In the 1920s, if you remember, the immigration laws did nothing to stop Mexicans from coming here to work. Actually, it encouraged them. And so they had been encouraged to work in the fields during the 1920s, but now faced resentment. When there were no other jobs, now Americans wanted those jobs. So the Mexican repatriation program was created, and it called for the deportation of Mexican immigrants to open up their jobs to white men. And about 1 million were deported. Repatriation means returning or being returned to a country of one's citizenship. 60% of those that were deported to Mexico were U.S. citizens. There was also a Filipino repatriation program that was ran very similarly. The Farm Security Administration, or the FSA, established camps to provide food and shelter for migrant workers, whether they were Mexican migrant workers or American migrant workers. This led to the formation of Mexican-American farm labor unions, and in 2005, California actually passed the Apology Act that looked to acknowledge the mistreatment of Mexican immigrants and Mexican-Americans during the 1930s. By 1937, the national income and production were to levels that had not been seen since 1929, so it looked like it was rebounding. And government spending had really helped combat that economic crisis and spurred the recovery. However, FDR was worried about the effects of this government spending and the deficit that they were running, okay? Especially worried about inflation. In 1937, Social Security tax took effect, which cut into individual income. FDR also cut funding for some New Deal programs, which cost millions of jobs, which caused a recession, which led to unemployment rising, production slowing, and the stock market falling again. Okay, and so FDR's public image is really suffering at this time, especially because people felt he had relied on government spending to solve the economic problems, and now he was pulling that all back. By 1938, the New Deal is losing momentum. Okay, we're 6 years into these programs, and it still hasn't solved the problem. Republicans and conservative Democrats began gaining control in the legislature in the midterm election, and with lack of support, he can't enact any more programs. Okay, there is one exception to this, and this is the Fair Labor Standards Act. okay, which I think many of us benefit from today. There's a minimum hourly wage, a 40-hour max work week established. It abolished child labor. But aside from that, with the lack of support in Congress, many of these programs came to an end. However, 8 million Americans are still unemployed. And again, he's being criticized because the New Deal is being looked at as essentially a Band-Aid. It had helped, but it didn't fix the real problem. And what actually is going to help solve this problem is the United States being dragged into another world war. At the beginning of the crisis, many believed restricting government spending was the best way to correct the problem, and FDR comes into office and does the exact opposite. He enacted the New Deal in deficit spending, which is spending more money than the government receives in taxes. The New Deal pumped millions of dollars into the economy. It created jobs, regulated banking and investment, increased government involvement in labor disputes, and set a precedent of providing federal aid to farmers. All things that were not seen really prior. Some historians have actually labeled the growth of the executive branch under FDR as the beginning of the imperial presidency, or a presidency that exercises more power than given by the Constitution. And the country really begins to see this shift. They see this shift that it's no longer left to individuals or towns or local communities to provide for citizens. It is the government's responsibility for its citizens' welfare, which is the welfare state, a system which the government provides for health and well-being of its citizens. Conservatives were extremely critical of FDR and his New Deal. They believed it expanded the size and power of the federal government too much, and it hurt free enterprise, which is, essentially anyone can start a business, anyone, no one should have support, whatever. And they argued it hadn't solved the problem. Poverty and unemployment were still crippling a large portion of the country. However, there are some lasting programs. Today, many Americans depend on government agencies and programs that were established under the New Deal. Of those, we have Social Security. We have the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC. This ensures that saving accounts of individual bank depositors up to $250,000 are insured, meaning if the banks would close or collapse, you are supposed to be guaranteed up to $250,000 of your money. You don't just lose it all like they did in the Depression. The Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, protects investors in the stock market, much like what the FDIC does for individuals in the banking. National Labor Relations Board, which mediates labor disputes between unions and employers, is also a lasting legacy from the New Deal.